We're continuing today through our sermon series on rescue, and we've been talking about sin. And if you recall, the reason that we're talking about sin is because we like some hellfire and brimstone around here. It's actually not that. It's we want to become people who are marked by celebration and worship. And really what that means is we want to be people who live in the presence of God, who live in the temple, who live in the garden, who live with the blessings that God provides. But the thing that keeps people out of the garden is sin. And so in order to become people who worship and people who praise and people who have joy, we have to deal with this issue of sin. And so we've talked about a number of different aspects. Remember, we've been looking at the sin in the garden as kind of a template for the whole series. And we've talked about the idea of the temptation of sin and kind of the questioning that is kind of the beginning of the process of sin and all that kind of stuff. Well, today we have to get to the actual part of consuming the fruit. And what that means is that you're taking something that is antithetical to who God is and what He has called you to do, and you're making that part of your life. You're incorporating that into yourself. And I'll warn you at the beginning of this that this is a difficult sermon to preach. It's not, as I was studying this week and as I was preparing for it, it's just, this isn't the kind of thing that you want to have to communicate. It's interesting that we talked about Ezekiel at the beginning, and Ezekiel's told he has to eat this scroll, and this scroll is full of bitterness, it's full of sorrow, and it's a difficult word that he has to preach. And that's kind of the way that I feel today, is that this is going to be a difficult sermon for you all. It'll be a difficult sermon for me. I'd appreciate you praying that God would speak through this. Because the idea of sin and having to talk about it for basically the majority of this sermon is just not a fun thing to talk about. And I was reminded of the reason why it's so important to talk about this week as I was, I don't know if you guys ever spend any time on YouTube, but the thing is that one video leads to another. You guys know what I'm talking about? You say, I need to fix, my faucet, and pretty soon you're watching cat videos. Have you guys experienced that before? Okay, so I was kind of on a bit of something like that this week, where I ended up watching this video about these two people who had converted this van. Van life is a big thing right now. They'd converted this van and were traveling around, and they had a friend who had traveled with them, and later on they had a video that announced that this friend of theirs had passed away, and so then I looked at the friend of theirs channel, and she only had a few videos on her channel, and the first one just kind of gripped me. And in the first video that she had, she was introducing herself, and it started off with her in her bed, and she was feeling incredibly depressed and unmotivated, and then kind of hating herself for not getting out of bed and not doing anything productive, and just going through all of this just depression and doubt. And then as the video kind of progressed, it showed her, talking about the things that she'd learned in her life, and she'd learned that, she has to be true to herself, and she needs to accept all the parts of her, and it was basically a lot of kind of the modern view of the world in life. And then, the video was done so well. So one of the things that I've learned over the past 2 years of COVID, when I see a video on YouTube that's done so well, I am in awe. I will tell you that it's very difficult to do a video well. It's very easy to do it poorly. And so I looked at this and thought, this is done as well as a documentary would have been done a few years ago. Like, it just, the level of what can be done now if you have the knowledge and the skill set and the time, and it was video of her traveling around the world and all these different experiences that she's had, and going to this place and going to that place and all this other stuff, and talking about like the road ahead of her. And the thing that made it so sad was knowing that as I'm watching this video, that within a few months of creating this video, she had committed suicide. And it was one of those things where it just made me so sad just to think that this person seemed so lost. And they took all of the questions that they had and found all of the answers that the culture gives. And it provided no solace to them. And it's important for us to understand that when we talk about sin, the biblical understanding of what is wrong with the world. And you think about what's wrong with the world. The answer that the Bible gives to that question is sin. Sin is what is wrong with the world. And the reason it's so important that we talk about sin is because there is so much wrong with the world. And we can't just go on as if that's not true. We can't just go on and one of the things that's fascinating, we talked about this in our Sunday school class today, is there's this principle in the Bible that if somebody is going astray, there's a responsibility to warn them, to try to help them. There's a responsibility to do your best to help. Because they were made in the image of God and they have value to God, and it's incumbent upon us to do what we can to help. And so we have to talk about sin, because the Bible's framing of this issue is when we look at the world and we see the pain and the suffering and all the things that go on in this world, that the Bible says the reason that this exists is because of sin. And so we want to understand sin and what it means for us to engage in sin. Now, the Bible says of Adam and Eve that Adam took the fruit from the tree that she was forbidden, that her and Adam were forbidden to eat, and she ate some. And then she gave it to Adam and he ate some. And so what's happened here is that they've consumed into themselves, they've made a part of themselves something that is antithetical to the glory of God. That's the Bible's understanding of this. And we want to look at that today, that understanding of what is sin. And what's helpful to us is that in Romans chapter 1, Paul gives us some ideas. He elaborates on this very short bit of information that we get in the book of Genesis. In Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 18 through 23, it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." So the idea here from the book of Romans is that what we did was we took into ourselves something that was short of the glory of God. And so now we no longer reflect the glory of God. The problem is that we were made to be in the image of God. But now the problem is that we fall short of the glory of God. And so we've got this thing, this problem that really is a big problem. And that problem is that there's a constant reminder in the glory of God of who we should be but aren't. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Where you're in a job, let's say, and there's a certain knowledge or performance or something that you're supposed to live up to, and you constantly fall short? Have you ever been on a sports team and you constantly fall short? Have you ever endeavored in anything and you fail all the time at it? Have you ever, for instance, bought a motorcycle from a hippie and it was a complete disaster? And every time you try to fix it, you just find what it does is it reveals all of your inadequacies. And so you get upset and frustrated and angry, and then you realize that it's also revealing lack in your character. What happens when these things take place? Well, we as humans have a tendency to deal with this in very unhealthy ways. And what we find is that we start by consuming sin, and then sin ends up consuming us. And so there's a few things that we want to talk about today in understanding sin. The first one is incorporation. The second one is we want to understand the idea of reflecting glory. And then finally, we want to understand some internal truths. So let's start here with looking at incorporation. In the Bible, the idea here is that Adam and Eve eat the fruit and it becomes part of them. Something that lacks the glory of God now is part of them. And it's interesting because there's a sense in which our ideas, our experiences, our attitudes, they become part of who we are, and they shape us. They shape who we become. They shape our beliefs, our attitudes, our actions, our feelings, our view of ourselves. How many of you guys can remember vividly interactions that you had when you were just a child? Maybe kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade. Can you guys remember those, like vivid? Do you have vivid memories of that? Do any of you have vivid memories of other children saying, or maybe adults saying terrible things to you, of things not going well? How many of you guys have any of those feelings or memories? The thing that's interesting about us is that things from even way back when we were children, things that are said to us, things that are done to us, can become such a part of us that even 40 or 50 or 60 years later, they're still changing the way that we interact with people. They're still changing. I was getting a haircut recently, and the scissors came very close to my ear. Very close. And there's that noise that they make as they're cutting. Now, what happened when this took place is that a shiver ran through me. And the reason that a shiver ran through me is because I very vividly remember sitting on a stool in our kitchen in our house in California. So I would have been less than 6 years old. And I remember it was hot, and I remember I felt sleepy, and I remember my mom kept telling me to put my head straight because I kept, and she was giving me the haircut, and I have vivid memories of this. And what happened was she went to cut my hair, and she cut my ear. You know what happens now every time I get my hair cut? This is ridiculous. This is like 45 years later. I'm a grown adult. And when the scissors get close to my ear and I hear that cutting noise, it sends a shiver down my spine. And I wonder, if I live to be 90, will I at 90 years old be doing the same thing? I expect that I will. Because here's the thing, these experiences that we have become a part of us. We're shaped by them. And what's really interesting is when you look at what psychologists and psychiatrists will tell you about the motivation system of a human being is that we experience joy and we experience happiness and we experience a sense of well-being when we're getting closer to achieving our goals. We as human beings are a goal-seeking, goal-oriented animal. And I don't say that animal as like a way of making us less. I'm saying that we have a human body, but within this human body, within this animal body, there exists something that is distinct from the rest of the animals, but that it exists in this human bodies. And what this thing does is it seeks out a goal. That's what we do. And our whole system of joy and happiness is oriented around us getting closer and closer to that thing that we find value in, that goal. How many of you have ever been in a situation where you don't feel like you're getting anywhere in life? Is that a time of great joy for us? No, it's not, is it? It's not. When we don't feel it. Now, here's the thing. There's a lot of ways to make progress. You can make progress professionally. You can make progress personally. You can make progress around your house. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's a lot of things. But here's the thing. If you imagine a time, if there's ever been a time in your life where for more than a few days in a row, you got up and you never got out of your pajamas. And I'm talking about an adult. Like, as a kid, fair enough. You can do this through your whole childhood and be completely content. But as an adult, like, if you can think of a time when you got up for several days in a row and you stayed in your pajamas. There was a show called Chuck, and Chuck he wants to be a spy, and he gets basically fired from his spy job, and he's sitting there in his bathrobe, and he's got that huge bucket of those cheese puffs, and he's just eating them. Like, that's kind of my picture of how sometimes in my life I've felt. You're not getting anywhere in life. Those are times of not joy and happiness. Those are times of feeling sometimes worthless, feeling incomplete, feeling like you don't have what it takes. The thing that's important for us to understand is that having a value hierarchy, this is really important for us to understand. Having a value hierarchy, the thing that says in your mind that this is a worthy thing, this is what's really valuable in life, and I'm making progress toward that, is indispensable for having joy. You really can't have joy without it. What does that mean for us as far as Christian imagery? It means that if we feel like we're on our way back to the garden, we feel joy and contentment. When we feel like the way to the garden is blocked, when we feel like there's no way to get back to the garden, when we feel like there's no way into the presence of God, then we feel utter despair. And the thing is, it doesn't matter whether we can go out from here and talk to people who don't believe in the Christian symbolism or imagery at all. We can talk to anybody on the street, and the thing is true. Like, if there's not something in your life that you say, this really has value, this really has worth, this really has merit, and I am on my way to that place. If they don't have that in their life, they will not experience any kind of joy. So here's the problem that we run into. And this is important that we understand this, is that if we have a value hierarchy, we have the opportunity for joy, but we also have the opportunity for pain. Because when you have that value hierarchy, you can see yourself coming closer to it, or you can see yourself getting farther away from it. And the problem is that we as human beings have a tendency to find ourselves getting farther and farther away from it. There are times when we choose the wrong value hierarchy, and we achieve our goals, and we realize that they were the wrong goals altogether, and so now we've realized that we're actually really far from what we should have really been doing, and that brings us pain. Have you guys ever done that? Have you ever done that? You say to yourself, this is what I want to do with my life. This is what I want my life to be about. And you go and you pursue it. Maybe you think, oh, if I only have the right career, and you sacrifice all kinds of relationships, and then you get that promotion that you've always wanted, and then you're there for a year, and you realize, this hasn't made my life any better. And I'm actually farther away from what really has value in my life. I gave up all these relationships for it. That brings you pain. Or maybe you have the right value hierarchy, but you find yourself getting farther and farther away from it, and you still feel that pain. See, here's the problem, is that God has made us as human beings. He's made us in His image, which means that we find Him as the highest, most valuable, most worthwhile thing. And as our lives get closer and closer to reflecting Him, as we get closer and closer to the presence of God, we experience joy, we experience happiness, we experience fulfillment, we experience those things. And as our lives get farther and farther away from Him, we experience despair, we experience hopelessness. And so most of us experiencing failure in getting back to the garden decide that what we can really do is we can dispense with the hierarchy altogether. We can be our own God. All I need to do is be true to myself. The problem is it doesn't work. Because we're made to have a goal. And to say my goal is myself, that doesn't work. Because you're already there. You're already yourself. Did it. Now what? See, this is the conundrum that our modern world finds itself in. It has experienced the despair of not being able to achieve what it really would find joy and happiness in. And so it says, well, let's get rid of the hierarchy, the value system. Let's get rid of the goal altogether. Let me just be true to myself. And then it finds that it can do nothing but despair, as there's nowhere to go and nothing to do. Jesus encounters this in Matthew chapter 9. Jesus is experiencing a ministry where he's proclaiming the kingdom of God. And the crowds are always following Jesus around. They always want to be near him. They always want to hear what he has to say. But they always press in on him. They always have so many needs. They always have so many hurts. They always have there's so much sin in the world. And there's so much pain and suffering that comes from that sin. The question is that do you just not want to get away from that? Matthew 9:36, it says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And I cannot tell you how many times in the last few years those words have come back to me. Because if we as Christians open our eyes, and maybe you're experiencing joy, maybe you feel the Spirit, and the Spirit is leading you to becoming more Christ-like, and you experience that in your life, and so you're experiencing joy. But the thing that we have to do as Christians is open our eyes to the world around us. Is that common? I find that as I open my eyes and see the world around me, what I see is people who are sheep without a shepherd. Like the young lady from YouTube who ended her own life. The question is, when Jesus sees that these people are like sheep without a shepherd, what does a shepherd do? Leads sheep to life. What we have to understand about our sin is that our actions, our thoughts, our attitudes, our feelings, all these things that exist contrary to the glory of God, destroy the joy and the happiness of what we were meant to experience. That our life is going to be consumed by something, and that consumption is going to be looking like the consumption of our life into the glory of God, or the consumption of our life into something far less glorious. I was talking to somebody recently who was telling me about their fear in their life, and how their fear in their life had come to different points. And that in trying to address the fear in their life, they had started to realize how their life was actually overcome by fear in so many different areas. And the only thing that I could really tell them was that, in my experience, when you give yourself over to something, that thing will consume you. That if you're a fearful person and you give part of your life over to fear, that fear will never be satisfied with just that part of your life. That fear will start to invade the rest of your life. And pretty soon you will find yourself fearful of this and fearful of that and fearful of this and fearful of that. And pretty soon you will be fearful of everything. It will consume you. If you're a person who is angry and you give your anger a part of your life, it will take the rest of your life. It might not happen tomorrow, but eventually it will take the rest of your life. If you are a person given over to lust and you give part of your life over to it, pretty soon it will take the rest of it. Because the reality is we're goal-oriented beings. And when we decide that something has value, we start giving more and more of our life over to that thing. And so if you put at the top of your hierarchy, I'm going to experience satisfaction, I'm going to experience relief from my fear by giving into it, then you've made that relief from that fear your value, you've made it your God, and it will take more and more of your life. If you say, I love the feeling of power when I'm angry, and I'm going to give part of my life over to that, well, you put that on the throne, and now you're going to give it the rest of your life. That's the way that our life works. And the outcome will be destructive to you and to those around you because you will have incorporated those things into your life. You're either incorporating the glory of God into your life or you're incorporating something that's far less than the glory of God. And your outcome will be commensurate with what you've chosen. Well, secondly, we need to understand reflecting the glory of God. So the interesting thing to me about human beings is we strive for excellence. We do. And you say, well, you don't know me. Because maybe you don't strive for excellence. I don't know. But I think you do more than you think you do. Let me give you an example. Maybe you say to yourself, hey man, I just don't feel motivated by things. I don't really feel like I strive for excellence. You probably do more than you think you do. Here's the thing. If I get invited over to dinner at your house, what's that going to look like? Am I going to ring the doorbell and you're just going to shout, come on in? And I'm going to let myself in. And you're going to say, I'm back here and watching TV. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to sit down because you're watching TV. And you're going to say, shh, I like this part. Don't interrupt it. If you want something to eat, there's stuff in the fridge. Go figure it out. Is that the way it's going to be if I go over to your house? I doubt that. I've been invited to a lot of people's houses and it's never been like that. Now, here's the thing. How many of you guys remember Martha Stewart? You remember Martha Stewart? Like, she made, I don't know, like at least $100 telling people how to make everything in their life, like, amazing, right? You know, the thing that's funny is she would go out in her front yard and she would, like, find a bunch of sticks and then she would, and pretty soon it's like this really neat wreath. And she's like, oh, you can put this on your door. And she made a lot of money telling, like, and nothing was good enough for Martha Stewart, right? She had a way of like turning everything had to be something, and it had to be special, and it had to be fancy. And so many people watched her. Now, here's the thing. I'm not saying they did any of those things, but they watched her doing it. One of my favorite things is to go look on YouTube and see people doing amazing things. How many of you guys like that? You watch and you see these people who have amazing skill and they're building something or they're making something or they're restoring something. And I think to myself, that's neat. Now, I'm not going to be as amazing as they are at any of those things. But the fact that I will even tune in and watch that says something about the human nature, doesn't it? It says that there's something about excellence that draws us in. There's something about, and we strive for it. Now, some of us strive harder than others, fair enough. But there's something in all of us that strives for excellence, that's oriented toward it. And what it is that we were made in the image of the glory of God. That God is the greatest thing that could possibly exist. If you think of the superlative of anything, that's God. And that's why the superlative of anything, like you can go on YouTube and you can find somebody making the most amazing paper mache whatever, and if it's really the most amazing, you can be transfixed even though you've never done it since you were 5 years old and you're never going to do it again. You can be completely transfixed by seeing somebody do that because glory is something that we're attracted to. And that's an amazing thing for us to consider. In Psalm chapter 5, verse 12, it says, For you bless the righteous, O Lord, you cover him with favors as with a shield. What that's talking about is that the righteous person ends up being surrounded by blessings, surrounded by glory. And that's what we all are hoping for. That's us reflecting the glory of God and seeing that reflected in our lives around us. But the interesting thing is that, do you guys remember Martha Stewart got in a bit of trouble? Now, I don't know her personally, and I don't know if this is true or not, but there was the problem that she went to jail for, and that's not what I'm talking about. But I think I remember something. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but didn't she have some kind of like assistants or something that came out and said she was a really, really terrible person to work for? Do you guys remember that? The people that said that she was just a tyrant and that she was just, right? Now, here's the thing. I don't know if that's true or not. She might be the nicest person that's ever lived, and I don't want to talk bad about her in that. What I find interesting, because I don't know, is that somebody knew enough to know that whether those accusations were true or not, they knew that it would hurt her, right? They knew, there's two possibilities here, right? She was a terrible person to work for, and somebody said, I will get back at her, and they knew that this would get back at her. Or maybe she was a great person to work for, and somebody was jealous, but they knew that this would hurt her. Either way, the interesting thing to me is that somebody knew they knew that people wouldn't say, well, who cares? And the idea here is that this part of her was being suppressed. The fascinating thing that we as human beings know, we know this for sure, and you know this, because the thing is, if I was coming over to your house today, I would bet, let's say this, I'm going to choose one of you at random, and I'm going to come over to your house right after church for lunch. How many of you are leaving right now to do some work around your house? Right? Mark, I appreciate the honesty back there, buddy. Now, here's the thing, like that, we know that, right? Because that's what we do. Like, kick the dirty clothes under the couch, right? Or the Cheetos, or whatever it is that's on the floor. And you're gonna be, because you want to, right? You know that you don't live up to the glory that you should. And so there's two ways of dealing this. When we fall short of glory, there's two ways of dealing with it. And one of them is to pretend that we actually do, to suppress the idea that we don't live up to the glory. But that's exhausting. And the second way is to deny the glory in the first place. See, in Romans chapter 1, verse 18, it says that God's wrath is being revealed. Why? Because of the unrighteousness of men. Well, why? Because by their unrighteousness they suppress the truth. The idea behind this passage is really interesting, in that what happened to us as human beings is that we didn't live up to the glory of God, and we found it exhausting to pretend that we did, so we just started denying that God was glorious. And that is destructive beyond imagination. Because what it says is that not only are we in a huge predicament where we're all being miserable because of our sin, it hides the way out of the sin. And if you don't think this is true, think about, let's go out right now, all of us, and we'll go down to Mill Avenue, and we'll start talking to people about sin. How do you think that's going to go? How many of you think that's going to be pleasant? It's not. Why? Because we don't want to admit that there is a such thing as a good and glorious God. Because if we admit that there's a good and glorious God, then what we're admitting is that we fall short, that it's not really God's problem, it's our problem. And we don't want to admit that because we don't know what to do with it. Here's the issue. The issue is that in our world right now, people are hurting and people are suffering and people are experiencing the kinds of trauma that lead them to want to take their own lives in some cases. And they're doing that. And the whole time, we can't talk about the fact that there is a God out there who is good and that is glorious beyond compare and that loves us and wants to save us from our sins. We can't talk about it. And the reason we can't talk about it is because we can't imagine a way out. I was watching YouTube. There's a guy on YouTube that basically he goes around and he shows these houses off that are like $100 million houses. You ever seen any of these on YouTube? $100 million houses. Imagine that you are somebody who's in the market for a $100 million house. I know that'd probably be that wouldn't quite meet our needs, but let's say that we're going to do that. And so we have a contractor come in, and this guy's like, I've built so many $100 million houses, you wouldn't believe it. And we say, okay, you sound like the guy, you can build our $100 million house. And so he's taking us on this tour of the house after it's finished, and he says, oh, here, this is your elevator, this is the system that pulls up the car that you want. You just put it in on your phone, and the system will pull up the car, because we know you have a lot of cars, it's going to pull up the one that you want. And he's showing us all this, and then we get into the middle of the living room. And he says, man, look at this chandelier. And you're like, well, here's the problem. It looks like here in the middle of the floor, there's this big bump, and it looks like you've just put tile over a bunch of garbage here in the middle of the floor. And he said, have you seen the chandelier? And we say, well, no, let's talk about this. This is not. He goes, no. At the end, we just have construction debris, and we needed a place to put it, so we put it right here. But we tiled over it. I mean, it's a little crunchy and stuff. Just stay off of it. It'll be fine. Now, would it matter to you that the rest of the house was amazing? Probably not. Would it say something about the character of the builder? Probably would. You understand the issue here, right? That God is the most glorious thing, person, being that could possibly exist. And that when God makes something, it reflects His glory. And that when we choose not to reflect His glory, when we choose something that's less than Him, when we choose something like lying, when we choose something like lust, when we choose something like greed, and we make that our God, that is the highest thing, and we come to reflect that, and then we come into the presence of God, you understand that that's an affront to the character and nature of God. God's not going to be like, hey, look at all that I've made. I've made this, and I've made that, and I've made this, and they're all perfect. Oh, and then there's Joe. If your name's Joe, I'm really sorry. I apologize. It was not intentional. It's just a name that came to me. Let's say Steve. If your name is Steve, I apologize. My name's Steve, that's why I'm using it. Here's Steve. Okay, let's move on. Look at these other people I've made. You know what I'm saying? Like, you understand the problem here, right? This is why sin separates us from God. And the problem is that we know this, but we can't do anything about it because we can't be saved by good works, because good works aren't good enough. They'd have to be perfect works. So let's talk about internal truths. See, the thing that we have to grapple with is it's not just our actions. Because the thing is, if it was just our actions, we might be able to cobble something together that might look presentable. And that's what we generally try to do. We try to cobble things together and say, well, really, I'm not that bad. Really, I'm getting close. And it's good because we can present that to people. Image management has been made a lot easier by social media, because I can take a picture, well, I can't, but somebody who's good at stuff can take a picture and make their lives look really cool and interesting and fun and wonderful, and make they can take a picture of themselves handing a $100 bill to a homeless person and go, oh, look, and they can make themselves look really good. Social media is great for that, but the problem is that in reality, it's far worse than we know. And this is why this sermon is hard to preach, because the thing is that as bad as we think sin is, it's far worse than we know. I asked you guys earlier, how many of you know or can remember something in your childhood where somebody made you just feel really bad about yourself, or something made you feel really bad? And almost all of us have that. But I could also ask a similar question, how many of us can remember a time when we made somebody else feel really bad? I can. When I was a kid, I used to get made fun of quite a bit, and it was always a relief when somebody else was getting made fun of. I thought, it's not my turn right now. And so I could join in and try to keep the attention diverted away from me. And I don't know what that did to that person. But I can imagine that there's probably people out there who at 50 years old can think back to things that I said to them. It's not hard for me to imagine that there's all kinds of trauma and hurt that I've caused all over the place, some of it even while I was trying to do good things. The problem is that those things weren't perfect. And a lot of what makes these things imperfect is a lot of the things that we do, they come out of imperfect internal states. What I mean by that is this, is that there are times when, how many of you guys, I'm speaking to guys here, have ever been in the middle of something really important, namely watching some sports on TV, and your wife or your kids ask you to do something? Okay, none of you. So here's the thing. I know as a guy that the way that we as guys respond to this is we say, I would love the opportunity to take this moment away from this unimportant thing that's happening over here and to serve you wholeheartedly so that you would know how important you are to me vis-a-vis a contrast with what this game actually is providing for me. I want you to know. That's how we handle this, right, guys? All right. Oh, I even see some wives going, yeah, that's the way they handle it. Well, here's the thing, is that in reality, what happens is this. You say, oh, okay, right? Have you ever done that? Now, the thing is that the person that you're doing this for knows that you're doing it for them, but they also know that you don't want to. You understand what I'm saying here, right? It's like that, you might as well have just not done it. Now, if you're a wife or a child, you might say, hey, excuse me, don't speak for me. I want them to do it. I don't care if they like it. Fair enough. But we all know what I'm talking about, right? Well, the idea is that we have ways of hurting each other that, I mean, we could probably not, if we started now, we could probably go for the next 20 or 30 years just writing ways that we have of hurting each other, of belittling each other, of devaluing each other. We have all kinds of ways of doing it. And sometimes in the midst of our greatest experiences of thinking that we're doing something right, we're still not doing something right. I was watching a show this week, or not this week, of the other day, let's say, and it was about Haiti, and it was talking about Haitian orphanages. Have you guys heard about Haitian orphanages? Here's the thing. What's happened is so many people have gone down to Haiti to adopt kids. Now, if you've adopted a kid from Haiti, please, I'm not saying anything bad about what you've done. I'm talking about larger social issues. Now, here's the thing. What's happened is that apparently supply has not kept up with demand. And so what some people in Haiti have understood is that some families in Haiti actually pick the best of their children to take to an orphanage. Have you guys heard about this? This is actually becoming a big problem. Why would they do that? Well, because if their child can get adopted by an American family, then they can get a job when they get old enough in America, and they can send money back to the family. And so they'll pick the best of their children to send to an orphanage. Now, here's the thing. Everybody in the process thinks that they're doing something good. The person that's going down there for adoption thinks, I'm going to help somebody who needs it. And the parents who are sending their kids to the orphanage think, well, I've got these other kids and we can't take care of them. We can't afford it. So everybody in the process thinks that they're doing something good. But what's happening is a lot of these kids are growing up in orphanages, not getting adopted, and having their lives turn out in ways that they never thought they would. You see, the thing that's interesting is that we as human beings, because we're not all that we should be, sometimes even in the midst of thinking that we're doing the very best that we can, we have a way of messing everything up. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 through 45, it says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust." In order for us to be perfect in all of our actions, we'd have to be perfect internally. In all of our emotions, in all of our attitudes, in all of our loves, in all of our hates, in all of our reasoning. We would have to be perfect in all these ways, and we have the inability to attain this. We can't achieve this on our own. Now, this is why I said that this sermon is difficult, because when we talk about sin, what we have to understand is sin, the lack of the glory of God, is the root of all of the suffering that is around us. It's the root of all of our suffering, and it's the root of all the suffering of the people around us. And until we come to the understanding that we are powerless to do anything on our own to deal with this, then we will simply continue to try to cover up the problem. We'll just simply continue to mask over it and act like it's no big deal and act like it's the little fixes that we can come up with are good enough. The reality of the situation of sin is that we cannot handle it on our own. In Psalm chapter 51, verse 1 and 2, David writes this psalm after he's done something so terrible that he can't possibly undo it. Somebody is dead because of his sin. And in Psalm 51, verse 1 and 2, it says, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." When we truly understand the depth of our sin, the only thing left for us to do is to turn to the holy God for His mercy. It's not to run away from God. It's not to deny His glory. It's actually to see His glory more clearly than we've ever seen it. That not only is God so glorious that He is perfect in every way, but He's so glorious that He can find a way out of our problem with sin. God's love can transform and redeem the problem of our sin. And He'll do that through Jesus Christ. Now, we have a couple more sermons to go before we get fully into that answer. And so I ask you, I know this was a tough sermon, hold on. We'll get to the good stuff, I promise. Well, how do we apply this? Number one, believe in God's glory. We have to start giving our mind completely to the glory of God, seeing every part of Him as marvelous, not letting anything in our minds and the things that we hear take away any of His glory. Secondly, we need to belong to Him through the covenant. We have to put our fate completely in His hands. I know the thing to do when we feel the weight of our sin is to try to run away from God, but we have to resist that. We have to throw ourselves completely on His grace and mercy. And finally, we need to become glorious by being transformed to His goal of glory. What are the riches He has for us? Well, we'll get to those. But it's important for us to understand that as weighty as this problem of sin is, that God's glory is sufficient.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.